All right, welcome back everyone to the Lorcana Academy. I am Airball. I'm your tenured tryhard on staff, and today we're trying something a little bit different. So normally I would take you through the Pixelborn streets. We'd play some games on the Pixelborn client, but today we're going to take a bit of a deep dive into some data. And so a couple weeks ago, I made a tier list video, and you can see it around my head somewhere. I'm sure YouTube will recommend it in some way or another if you haven't seen it. And what I did was I ranked what I thought the top decks were based on two things. A, vibes, and B, the paper gameplay results from a variety of different tournaments that have happened over the last few months. And there are some obvious problems with that. The first is that vibes aren't really data. And the second is that paper results at this point aren't really data either. The sample size of those tournaments is not really high. And even when you do get enough games to try to draw some conclusions, you have to also deal with the fact that most players don't have access to the full set of cards. So maybe some decks overperform in an environment where people just can't get 4 copies of Rapunzel or something like that. So I discovered recently that the Pixelborn developers have published the data for the matches that happen on their client on their Discord, and you can go check it out yourself. Just head on over to their Discord. The raw data is published for everyone to see. It is in a text format, so you kind of have to do some cajoling to get it into a format that's easy to read, but that's what I've tried to do for you today. So what we're looking at right now is the win rate matrix of all of the color archetypes, color pairs of Lorcana in matches on Pixelborn, importantly, where one player in the match at least was in the top 100 on the Pixelborn client. So I had a few options. They have 3 different data sets. You can either go with the complete corpus, where you deal with all the games that happen on Pixelborn. You can do what I did and use the one that has one player at least in the top 100. Or you can use an even more restrictive data set where you have 2 players in the top 100, so you get a very rarefied view of the metagame up at the very top, but you also have a much smaller sample size. So I decided that I wasn't going to use the big data set, because what I found there was that most of the decks performed 50-50 when you're playing against random players on the Pixelborn ladder, because people are just sleeving up any old deck, and the skill level isn't particularly high. And on the flip side, the dataset sample size for where you had 2 players in the top 100 was also very small. So I thought this was a good compromise. You can see even here, all of the gray boxes here indicate that the matchup had fewer than 15 games on the client where one person was in the top 100. So you can imagine this would be filled with even more gray if I had gone with the bigger sample size, or if I had gone with a more restrictive data set. And if I had shown you a more filled matrix with a bunch of 50s everywhere in the graph, I don't think that would be particularly informative either. So I think this is the way to go. So let's look at this graph for a second and try to draw some general conclusions about the metagame. So the first general observation here is that there are haves and have-nots on the Pixelborn client in the top 100. So there are some decks that are very popular, and there are some decks that are very unpopular. And you can tell just by looking at the number of entries in a archetype's row how many games were played, or like roughly how well played the decks were. So you can see here up at the top we have Ember Steel has data versus almost every matchup, and the same is true for Ruby Amethyst, and the same is true for, surprisingly a little bit, Sapphire Amber. But you have no data at all for something like Ruby Steel, and you have very few entries for something like Ruby Sapphire. That doesn't mean that matchups didn't occur at all. It just meant that there were less than 15 of them. 15 matches was my cutoff before putting in numbers into this matrix, because you would get like crazy results sometimes. Some matchups you would see as like 80-20, but you'd have no confidence in it because it went 4-1. There were only 5 matches played. So definitely the most popular decks you can see were, Amber Steel, Emerald Amethyst, Ruby Amethyst, and Sapphire Amber. So that's the first general observation here. The second general observation is that within the top 100, a lot of things are playable. So there are very few data points in this matrix that are outside of the 40 to 60 range. And most of them actually also fall within the 45 to 55 range, which is the sign of a pretty healthy meta, I think. So remember, there's no card access issues here. Everyone can play any deck that they want that's legal in the format. And so usually you can expect that to turn up what the best overall decks are. And you can see that there's actually no one deck that's just an absolute runaway. The over here on the right-hand side, you can see the top 5 decks overall by win rate, and they're very, very close. Ruby Emerald overall had the best win rate in Week 6 with a 53-ish% win rate overall against the field. And 5 decks here, just the top 5, were all barely beating 50%, and the rest were mostly like barely below 50%. So the actual range, the actual overall win rate range was fairly compressed. So the conclusion here is that you can play almost anything you want and have a good chance to win. The next thing that we can look at is the decks that actually do have some polarizing matchups. So these are decks that have really good win rates against some decks and really poor win rates against others. And you can see that, for example, this Emerald Amber list here has a fantastic win rate of 71% against Sapphire Emerald, but a putrid win rate against this Amber Amethyst list at down to 26%. And remember, these are all like statistically significant. They would not have made the matrix if there weren't a bunch of matches for it. So you can see that there are some decks that perform very well against some archetypes and some that don't. There are also decks that perform pretty much the same no matter what they're up against. And you can see this Amber Steel list up here at the very top. Almost everything is compressed into this like 47 to 53% win rate. It's not outstandingly dominant against any particular deck in the field, but it's also not terrible against any of them, and you can kind of understand why. Amber Steel has a very proactive, almost solitaire-like game plan that doesn't care so much about what the opponent is doing. It's just trying to do its thing as powerfully as it possibly can. The other question that I had that I wanted answered by this graph was just how good is control in the meta, because Ruby Amethyst has done very well in paper, and I was wondering how much of that was based on like just paper results, like how much of that is just because people playing paper haven't played a ton of matches, they don't have the skill built up yet in the same way that the top 100 players on Pixelborn do. How much of that is card availability, and you can see that like Ruby Amethyst had a okay win rate. It was 51.62 against the field, but the overall archetype win rates were kind of a little lackluster. You could definitely attack it with certain decks in the meta. So this 43% down here is pretty damning. It's about as bad as you can expect one of the top tier decks to do against anything. So it was interesting to me that the Ruby Sapphire list performed so well against Ruby Amethyst. Also, I had seen some speculation and speculated myself that Amber Steel might actually overall be a positive win rate against Ruby Amethyst, but that also doesn't seem to be the case. So over here we have about a 53% win rate for Ruby Amethyst. Some of that might just be because maybe poorer players were picking up Amber Steel or whatever, because not all of the players in these matches, of course, were top 100, but on average, Ruby Amethyst did a little better on the ladder than Amber Steel did. So one last little bit of insight here, one last thing that appears to me off the top of my head is that there are definitely some unexplored possibilities still in this meta. So we see that there are definitely some decks that have a bunch of games played. We have Amber Steel, like one of the most played decks by far, Ruby Amethyst, of course, and then you have a bunch of decks that are barely played. So you can see that maybe you can imagine that some of the decks are barely played maybe because the top 100 players don't think they're that good, but there are also decks that are being played by some subset of people in the top 100. And these are the decks that I would like to see explored more, because someone thinks they're good. The decks are performing well enough to keep those players in the top 100, and maybe there's some room for innovation. So like the Ruby Amber deck that I played on the channel, maybe the video hasn't come out yet. I'm not sure what order these things are going to be published yet. But these are kind of like pet decks for a lot of really good Lorcana players, and these are the ones that I would keep an eye on going forward. So if you want to experiment with like a deck that isn't, that's a little off the beaten path but can still perform, I would take a look at something like your Ruby Ambers here or something like that. Okay, so one last chart for you all. This is kind of the money shot. The last thing we were looking at was the win rate matrix. It was very theoretical. It was very like data. It was very data. But like the question that should immediately come to your mind as a competitive player is, okay, what do I do with this? What choices should I make based on this data that I see before me? And so what I did was I put together this pie chart that shows you the overall play rate of all the decks in the top 100 player meta on Pixelborn. And it's not that hard to suss out. Amber Steel and Ruby Amethyst are each about a quarter of the meta. Amber Sapphire down here is picking up is about 13%, and then you have a couple 8% here for Amethyst, Emerald, and Sapphire Steel, and then the rest is just other. It's like a mishmash of every other color pair in the format. So the big bads obviously are Amber Steel, Amethyst Ruby, and Amber Sapphire, and you want to have good matchups against those in general. So if you're trying to figure out which deck to play, you could just look at that matrix and try to sort of like eyeball what you think the best decks are against the most played decks in the meta. And that would probably do a reasonably good job. But what I did for you guys was I actually took the weighted expected win rate against the 5 most played decks in the format. So you can see that the top 5 decks over here on the right, or on the left rather, are represented in the pie chart. And imagine that you played against Amber Steel with your deck about 24% of the time, say, and you played against Ruby Amethyst about 22% of the time, say, and you played against Amber Sapphire about 13% of the time, say. If you take all of that and you take your deck's win rate against those decks, how many matches should you expect to win? And the results were a little surprising. Over here on the right, we see that Ruby Amethyst is actually the deck that comes out on top if you only consider the top 5 decks played in the meta. So if you only play against those 5 things, like if you're going to a tournament or something where you are unlikely to see, the other worst decks represented, then you can expect a win rate of about 51.64%. And Emerald Amber was bringing up the rear a little bit by 51.25%. And then, surprisingly to me, Amber Steel had basically exactly a 50.44%, basically exactly a 50% win rate against the top 5 most played decks, which I thought was pretty cool. And unintuitive. You see from the earlier matrix that it actually had a pretty good win rate overall, and most of them were over 50, but it turns out that most of those were actually against the other decks of the format. And if you just limit it to the best ones, you're kind of a coin flip. Now, again, some of that is down to player skill. Maybe more bad players in the top, more bad players were playing Amber Steel and the top 100 wasn't, and so these numbers are skewed because of the pilots. We don't have access to that data. It's hard to know. But overall, if you want to, just based on math, pick a deck that will be positive in your tournament meta, then it's probably going to be one of these 3. Ruby Amethyst, Emerald Amber, and Amber Steel. So that's about it for this video. If you are interested in acquiring those cards, of course, you can head on over to our sponsor, Coolstuffinc.com, and stock is starting to come in. You have to kind of be watchful of it. I know a lot of things are out of stock right now, but if you're in the right place at the right time, then it is, of course, the best place to find booster packs and singles. And you can use the code Academy for 5% on your order. 5% off your order at checkout. It lets them know that we sent you, and it keeps the lights on over here. So speaking of the lights, I'm about to turn them off. That is it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I am very curious to hear what you guys think about this one. Obviously, I did a very cursory view of the data this time, and I would like to know what kind of stuff you guys would like to know going forward. Because obviously there's a lot of different analysis that we can do. What kind of information would be useful to you when it comes to picking your deck? What are you curious about? What do you want to, what's something that you want to know but just don't have the time or effort or know how to figure out? So that is going to be very interesting. If you guys tell me what you want, then I will try to make it, I will try to put that in the next video that I make on the subject. And yeah, so that's it for me. I will see you guys all in the next one. Later.